Hello, everyone. I'm Leanne Jackson, senior law editor at Forbes, and today is the big TikTok case before the U.S. Supreme Court. I've been speaking with Kevin Goldberg, who is our legal analyst, about how the oral arguments went this morning. What can we expect? Can 800 million users in the United States, I believe, or potentially around the world, but specifically in the United States, could they lose access to TikTok if the Chinese ownership doesn't divest? I want to bring in Kevin to discuss a little bit more. We're talking about the Beijing owner, ByteDance. There have been allegations that China has influence over companies within their country, and the government is concerned about what this can mean. Are these national concerns, national security risk concerns, legitimate in your mind? And how did they play out today in oral argument?
Well, it doesn't really matter what I think. It matters what the justices think. And I think just to explain what that national security concern is, because there was a lot of discussion of it during the oral argument today. It's that a user goes on TikTok and their information is being collected like many other social media sites. Only what makes TikTok different is that TikTok is, of course, owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance, and that Chinese company is subject to regulations that might require ByteDance to turn over a lot of the information about personal habits of the user, personal information of the user, and that the Chinese government might use that in a number of ways, whether it's to destabilize the United States by a targeted misinformation campaign, or even something more sinister to blackmail individual users based on their past content or past user history. And the question really comes down to whether the justices defer to the government's allegations that this is what is happening, or ask for a little more specificity, a little more proof that it's actually happening. Because really, what we aren't sure about, this is part of the problem. We aren't actually sure what the Chinese government is doing, and that's what obviously makes it a little scary. The district court seemed to accept the government's explanation and deferred to them. That's not always the way it's been historically at the Supreme Court or in other courts. We look back at something like the Pentagon Papers case from 1971, formerly known as New York Times versus United States. And that Supreme Court was very skeptical of the Nixon administration's claims that if the Washington Post, New York Times had published a volume of research on the United States involvement in the Vietnam War, it would destabilize that war campaign. And it said, no, we can't engage in a prior restraint here. Obviously, there's some differences, right? But the question is, will the court defer to those claims or not? And if they do, the law likely gets upheld. If they don't, I think TikTok has a better shot of winning for sure.
Well, there's definitely a lot of sort of an alliance of strange bedfellows who are in support of TikTok here, from content creators to the ACLU to the Libertarian Cato Institute. What are they saying about the constitutionality? I know you're with Freedom Forum, which advocates for First Amendment freedoms. What are the constitutional arguments here?
Well, the constitutional argument that this law violates the First Amendment is that it's not simply a requirement to, or a choice to divest for ByteDance, that they can choose what to do, stop operating, pay a fine, or sell TikTok. It's that they really are being forced to sell TikTok. And by doing that, this brings into play the free speech rights not only of TikTok creators, but of TikTok Inc., the United States corporation, and their rights are being impacted. And that this is on the basis of the content that is found on TikTok, which makes it a content-based law, which puts it under the strictest level of scrutiny that courts will apply. And the only way the law will survive First Amendment scrutiny in that situation is if there is a compelling interest for the law, and that the law itself is narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. So we talked about the compelling interest, and that is protection of national security. Well, is this the only way that can be done? Another thing that was discussed today was, are there other alternatives? Could the law have simply said TikTok has to be more transparent, more open about how it collects information, what it does, so that users can decide for themselves whether to opt out or not, whether to go to another platform? That was another big issue I think this case is going to end up hinging on.
Well, a lot of the other content creators, Facebook, X, YouTube, have filed amicus briefs in this case. How are they trying to distinguish themselves? Are they worried that this could be an issue in terms of an American company? Of course, this has already kind of been out there. American company using information about users in a way that is unauthorized, illicit, or potentially harmful.
Yeah, I think they were really trying. They were and are, and based on the argument today, we'll be happy to see it. The justices sort of agreed that there is to argue that there is a big difference between ByteDance, between TikTok being owned by ByteDance, a company that is owned by a Chinese corporation. I'm sorry, owned by a Chinese corporation and subject to the control of the Chinese government versus a US based company. There was some discussion about whether strict foreign ownership is a hard line, and I think that some justices agree that once you have a company that is outside the United States, it has no First Amendment rights whatsoever. I think a lot of these other social media companies would probably be pretty comfortable with that, as long as you don't start restricting the content of the speech within the United States by a US based company, even for national security reasons. So I think they're trying to really wall off that line at the border, frankly.
It's part of the government's argument that this isn't even a First Amendment case because it isn't about the content at all.
Yeah, and I believe it was just Chief Justice Roberts who said, "Well, isn't this really a corporate structure case, not a not a content and speech case?" So that is really a hinge point, I think, in which you could see a ruling. And if that is the hinge point, I think that bodes very well for the government, because I do think there were. I said I'm not sure that I found five justices that coalesced around one single argument. I feel more likely that there are five justices that were ready to side with the government. And maybe that's where they do it to avoid all of the downstream issues of, is this a content based law? Is there a compelling reason? Is it narrowly tailored? All of that stuff. I also, for that reason, do wonder if they're going to try to find another exit ramp and a procedural basis of, do we have the ability to just pause this and see how it plays out? Or see if President elect Trump steps in on his first day, undoes everything, or whether they can engage in some other way to push this down, because I know they felt this was just a really accelerated, compressed time frame, and that there are big decisions to be made. And so I do feel confident we're going to see something from the court by January 19th, though.
Yeah, they did fast track this case, and they have now 9 days to decide it before the effective date of the law, which is January 19th, one day before President-elect Trump's inauguration. And yes, it sounds like the Supreme Court has some separation of powers concerns in terms of this law that was
Yes.
passed. However, that hasn't really stopped this court so much lately. But they may try to find ways to thread the needle as we are discussing, and narrowly tailor their decision, because there are a lot of
Mhm.
tentacles to this constitutional content. And but there are a lot of people who love TikTok and want to find some solution. I'm sure, and I know this is not necessarily what you're a First Amendment scholar, but TikTok has to be preparing for this, preparing for the worst. They've had, well, more than 9 months, but this has been on the horizon for a while. What do you expect?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the law gave them 270 days, really, was until January 19th, was basically how how this time frame played out. It's not a lot of time according to TikTok. And that's one of their arguments as to, this really isn't about forcing us to choose. There's only one choice. First of all, the Chinese government would have to sign off on the sale of TikTok Inc., the United States based subsidiary. And that's not going to happen in that time frame. And second of all, even if we wanted to happen and could make it happen from a regulatory standpoint in China, it's impossible to simply rebuild everything in the short time frame. So TikTok obviously has been thinking about this, not just in a practical sense, but in a legal sense. And that was one thing that their lawyer, Noel Francisco, one argument that he made to the justices was, look, you can't just go around now or even in this time frame and start finding other engineers to rebuild the algorithm. And it's just impossible. So this is the end of TikTok, at least for the short term as we know it.
And that is quite a major blow to those who use social media. A lot of young people, younger generations are on TikTok. All generations, but this is quite. I mean, the way this will play out, it will be very interesting, because it is, as you mentioned, taking apart a major technology company and forcing them to not just divest but reconfigure entirely their entire platform. So the court has, as you mentioned, does seem determined to issue a ruling on this in one way or the other. So we will be watching. And Kevin Goldberg, Vice President, First Amendment Expert, Freedom Forum, I hope you will join us again when this ruling does come out.
I'd love to do that. Thanks.